Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun,
Hello.
and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
We launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today we're going to talk about matcha labeling part 3, classifications and matcha quality.
Yeah. So this is part 3 in our series of matcha labeling, which we think is super important. Doesn't sound like the world's most interesting topic, but there's a surprising amount to like unpack.
Yeah, like matcha label is not just, the price tag and barcode. It's about all the information that you can learn before you actually try the matcha.
And then we want to discuss what's the status quo of high quality matcha? What are those flavors or attributes, and how do they get in that matcha, and how can that be reflected on a label? So, like, what are all the different descriptors or measurements that we can use as consumers to then identify, oh, this would probably be a very umami heavy matcha, or this matcha might have a lot of nuance, complexity, and delicate flavors. So, like, actually break down what it is we want to see on labels and help consumers make associations between, oh, if I see this on a label, then it has these implications, both primary and secondary. But before we jump into that, let's talk about the extreme. What do we do when products have no label on them? Right? So, like Zongjun, imagine you walked into a wine store, you saw a bunch of prices, but every single label was obscured. And would you trust it?
I don't know. Sometimes you do see brands do that. Like the very concept of Muji is to, it literally means no mark, no label. All
Oh,
you,
I
you
didn't know that.
sometimes, yeah. Or sometimes you see some of the, third wave coffee brands or some of the more contemporary wine brands or even some of the tea brands. They intentionally trying to obscurify what exactly is going on in the product and create this sort of like it's just a image or it's just a name. It doesn't even say where the grapes or where the coffee comes from. But you
Yeah.
do see that happen in the market.
There was a really cool example of this. I think it was from a tea vendor in Singapore, and she was trying to create this hashtag no label tea movement. And the
Hmm.
idea was, like, you should trust your sourcing. She's not going to tell you what it is, and you shouldn't worry about it. Don't worry about whether or not it's like from a great producer or great whatever. Just enjoy it. Tea is tea. You should just enjoy it. And, I don't think this movement was very successful because, you
Yeah, to
really have
some
to build up
extent.
some brand credibility.
That's right. I mean that really is a I guess a hard requirement, for people to have the trust in the first place, right? Otherwise, like you can literally put anything in it, and no one's probably going to trust you.
Yeah. And I'd say that's where matcha labeling starts. Like, the very basic requirements are the brand. And, like,
Hmm.
if you look at the word brand, right, that goes all the way back to, like, cattle getting literally like branded with with a hot iron to show their mark, right? Like, it's someone's maker's mark. It's a brand. And that's kind of where the trust starts. And then everything after that, like, is just more information, whether or not it's the product name, whether or not it's some classification like culinary versus ceremonial grade, and then even more information about it, later on. Right. So I guess in the hierarchy, it all starts with the brand, and it is interesting. One notable example, we're consumers of is white tea, famous for mostly sourcing mainland Chinese tea, pu'er and oolong, and some green tea as well, and some other things, and a lot of white tea. And he's Paul, who's the brand owner behind that brand, is super famous for putting out like a $700 pu'er cake that's 200 grams, and I think it was called "This Tea is Fake." Right? It takes a serious brand to be able to pull that off and have people actually want to buy it. And there's no information about it. It was the opposite of a transparent label. And it's kind of, label anarchy that he's doing. And he's built up such a good brand and such good skill at sourcing that people actually trust that it's going to be good. And it's very hedonistic in nature, right? You're not doing any learning. You're just enjoying the tea.
Yeah, yeah. Or, like I feel like this type of brand. I mean, I myself is a Y2T consumer, and I fully trust their weight and their capability of sourcing. But like for someone to be able to enjoy their product, you really need to either have no knowledge about the product, you just want to enjoy the flavor, or you need to be very knowledgeable, and without the labeling you can figure it out by yourself, out of a lot of the hidden information. So I feel like that brands like this are a perfect starting point or perfect endpoint for a consumer journey. But
Hmm.
where do you go? Where do you grow your knowledge in between? I think requires a lot of other paths to be able to learn the information, to be able to gain the formative experience.
Yeah, exactly. And you could argue this, what we're talking about, is where a lot of the traditional matcha companies are. Those companies that have been around for 100, 200, 300 years, that have all of these products with these poetic names. They're all just called ceremonial grade and maybe suitable for thin tea, usacha, or thick tea, koicha. And they don't really give any, they don't tell you what cultivar they are. They don't tell you what region they were grown in. They don't tell you what proportions they were blended, when they were milled in, or when things were harvested. It's a complete black box blend. And it's kind of the same thing. It's our brand. Here's the name. Maybe we'll give you some poetic description about what our poetic name means. But you're just gonna have to trust us. You have to trust our brand.
Yeah, that's right. As a beginner, you probably uh, will be served, by someone who's more experienced of that kind of tea, and then you end up walking away, either thinking that okay, this is not for me, or thinking to yourself that okay, I like this product, and this is probably
Yeah,
really the starting point of your journey in wanting to know more about matcha and wanted to drink more matcha. But that's very one directional. You are getting served for a tea that someone else think is high quality, and they think that you might like it, right? Like you have no choice in this whole experience. You just simply receive, and you end up having some opinions. Like how are you going to uh, analyze your opinions or dissect your opinions into any quantifiable attributes? That's basically impossible.
yeah. And that brings down to like subjectivity of quality. What is quality? Who can determine what quality is? Is it just the price point on the price ladder as you move from something that cost, $15 a can to $60 a can? What's the difference? Why is that one $60? What happened there? Like, and how can I even appreciate it if I don't know anything about it and it doesn't have a transparent label where we know maybe the way it was shaded or how many days it was shaded, or the type of farm and the type of fertilizers they were using. All of the decisions that could have been made during the processing that led to something be or higher quality. It doesn't let consumers develop a complex set of preferences in other industries like we see in wine or we see in other parts of tea or in chocolate or even in coffee, right? Where there's really deep knowledge that's being conveyed by, let's say, like specialty coffee brands about what made that particular lot of coffee special. Maybe it had something to do with the elevation. Maybe it had something to do with the fermentation or the blending. Or I think counterculture is super famous for making sure that all of the green coffee, the unroasted coffee, has almost no moisture content to really reduce what they call the funk factor. Because
Mm.
even a little bit of residual moisture when those coffee bags get put on these container ships and shipped off to wherever they're going to be roasted, they have an even more stringent requirement that's ultra low moisture content, so that there's no weird mold or anything growing on that green coffee before it gets there. Right, so it's like these types of stories that are linked to processes or interventions or scarcity that get told to the consumer so that they can say, oh, you know what? I like this counterculture. It is a great example of a washed Ethiopian coffee from Edido. And not only is it a great expression of this place, but it also feels like it's been processed really well. It unfortunately really doesn't exist in matcha right now. There's like a few companies that are very close to doing it or that are doing it, But it's still like, I don't know, what is it, 2 or 3 years old now? Like it's super new.
Yeah, it's only in recent years that you start to see people paying attention to matcha with the lens of specialty products. But like when we are talking about quality, we are really talking about different kinds of quality, right? Quality can be qualitative, it can also be quantitative. Quantitative quality would be something like elevation, the name of the cultivar, days of the bushes getting shaded before harvest, or it can be qualitative quality like the story that you have just told. Brian, how do we assess quality and how do we balance, which part of the quality needs to be focused more on matcha?
Yeah, it's such a complex topic. And, you can almost segment it into two pieces. So one is like, what is quality for a commodity product? And then two, what is quality for a specialty product? And I think those two things are worth separating for a moment. So there's a concept in coffee called Q grader. And Q graders are typically the people who are buying, they could be buying specialty, but they're also buying commodity. I think the system was set up for commodity grade coffee. Coffee trades on futures, it's like a post colonial crop. Commodity prices, I think, range from anywhere from around $1 to $1.50 a pound green coffee. These Q graders for very, very large companies, food and beverage companies, this Q grading system got set up to sort through quality. And it was looking for all sorts of defects, largely linked to process. So, like, there's something called potato defect, where I think it's some type of fungus. Please don't quote me on that. Maybe it's caused by something else. That results in the coffee tasting weird. I know there's something called Rio defect that largely comes from coffee made in Brazil, and there are people who are trained to go through and sort coffee based on both objective and flavor, which you could argue is slightly subjective measurements, to give coffee a score, which would then determine its price, and then it would go on to be processed in a commodity-like product. And you can also be Q grader for specialty coffee as well. Um, so you have systems like this that are set up to meant to sort of standardize quality and put everything on the exact same page. Now, that said, when you start talking about really excellent coffees, you move into other realms like competitions, like the Cup of Excellence, which is in coffee, where also a group of experts will go around and taste it and cup coffee and determine what are some of the highest performing lots based on some set of also like specialty characteristics. And I think the one that was really famous was a coffee farm in Panama called Esmeralda. It has a longer name, but I forget it. Which realized that some of the coffee trees on their farm, on their plantation, tasted very different. And they, quote, rediscovered it. Arguably, there's a more complex history there, but to simplify it, they rediscovered geisha cultivar, which is a cultivar of coffee, separated it out because usually they blended it into everything else. And it ended up being this ridiculous floral coffee, and it set records for how much green coffee was sold at auction because it won the Cup of Excellence. And it got everyone reinterested in geisha cultivar, and now it's grown, in many other places. Very intentionally, and then those lots are usually always separated out because they get a higher quality price. So, things like Cup of Excellence have the ability to sort of discover and create new trends within the specialty industry, and those are ultimately decided by judges who have tons of coffee tasting experience. So, at the most basic level, Q graders can sort out good and bad roughly for the commodity market. You have these competitions and other grading systems. I know the SCA, Specialty Coffee Association, has a grading system as well to sort through what they would consider high or low quality, which, by the way those things are structured are also kind of arbitrary-ish, not super arbitrary, but, you're ranking across your preference for acidity. But like, how can you rank it across preference for acidity, especially in such a multicultural environment that coffee is, across, Oceania and Latin America and Africa. Anyway, it's a bigger can of worms. And then, you'll ultimately, the consumer's making the final decision. So that's how it's viewed in other industries. Within matcha, there are competitions, which are largely done by experts, and most tencha unground matcha is sold at auction. So that's being evaluated by these blenders that end up setting prices um, for those products, and then they also set the prices for the blends that the tencha gets blended into and then milled into matcha. So a very long and convoluted way of saying that right now for matcha, it's mostly done by expert evaluators. It may or may not be linked to what you might like in a matcha, Zongjun.
Yeah, and for all these master blenders, their goal is really to reach a flavor profile consistency across all these years, with different tea coming from different terroir in different vintage. So their goal is not necessarily to create a flavor profile that will be liked, especially liked by consumers outside of Japan. So that's really a contradiction that we are seeing right now in the market.
Yeah, it's like they almost view different tencha lots as ingredients that go into a larger blend.
Yeah,
Like they're
yeah,
not in kind of a way, it's an interesting metaphor for Japanese society. They say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease in America, but they say that I think it's the nail that sticks out of the board gets pounded back down in
yeah.
Japanese society. Um, so they take the best tensha to help even out the worst tensha in these blends that they create, harmonizing and not honoring the individual component parts.
Very collectivization kind of mentality.
I
But
hope we didn't make any enemies with that parallel, but it almost feels true though.
and you see that in a lot of the other tea blendings. It's not just Japanese matcha, but in a lot of the Chinese teas, pu'er, white tea, baicha, um, they are all blends, and I think it's very interesting that a lot of these blenders or these tea houses, their argument about blends is that single origin, sometimes the flavor can be very one dimensional, like single bush or single lot. There's a lack of complexity in their opinion, that they would actually prefer to do a blend, because it would add more flavor complexity into the final product.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because something's single origin or single cultivar has no guarantees that it's any good. It's a way
Yeah,
of protecting yourself and creating a better product.
that's very true.
What blenders are doing is they're saying, how do we get 1 plus 1 to equal 3? Right? That's what a really good blender does.
Or like
Especially for something as finicky agricultural.
0.2 plus 0.3 plus 1 equals 2. They're trying to like use whatever they can and reach a consistent flavor profile, which is very masterful if it's done well and so consistently
Yeah.
throughout generations and generations.
Now the problem is now, like, let's zoom out and put this back into context, because there's an absolutely great argument for why blends are a great thing and why they should exist and should continue to exist in the future. The problem is where you get bad actors, right? There's other than a distinct name, there's not much to go off of other than the trust that these brands have. And you can have, emerging brands that come in that try to have a slightly more transparent label, claim that there's something better, but the product inside them is actually much worse because there's very few regulations. And that's how you get into like super ceremonial, premium ceremonial, hyper ceremonial, etc. And it goes on and gets worse of people just trying to differentiate themselves. And whether or not it's single origin or it's a blend or it's pseudo single origin, is it? I mean, everything's a blend ultimately of different tea leaves. Like even if it's from Yame, it doesn't people can call it single origin, but if it's single farmer, that you get into the weird semantics of what single origin means.
But
The
I mean,
problem
like,
is that like people are just putting out a lot of crap, and it's hiding under these blends, and it's being obscured by these labels, and that makes everyone's label less interesting. So you can't like triangulate as a consumer why something tasted good or bad because you're not given the information to do it.
I mean, like, whether or not it's single origin or if it's a blend doesn't necessarily contradict with our, advocation of transparent labeling, right? Like, you can still have transparent labeling if the matcha is a blend. We want to know how much percentage of Asahi or Yabukita
True.
that went into that can of matcha. It's like, the transparent wine label like tells you how much percentage of different kinds of grapes in this bottle. I think that will be actually very helpful too. Although, like some blend house might, see their recipe as trade secret. But, we as a consumer would greatly benefit from, learning, the how does the complex flavor profile, where does the flavor profile come from? Like, and how does, by blending different cultivars into one can of matcha can drastically change the flavor profile and the texture. Or by tweaking all of the other attributes like dates of shade growth or different kind of harvest method, can really change the consumer experience. I think that's super important whether or not the can of matcha is a single origin or if it's a blend.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it makes me think of a really cool product developed by James Freeman of Blue Bottle Coffee way back in the days. It was called Three Africans, and it was a blend that always had three different origins of African coffee. And it was actually a flavor profile driven blend. So they're
Mm,
trying to keep it consistent. And depending on when you ordered it, you could look online and see, what was in this.
mhm.
Maybe it was, X% Kenya, X% Ethiopia, X%, Tanzania. And it was really cool to see that change, actually. And they would give you all sorts of information about it. It'd be cool to see more of that in matcha.
Absolutely. By having more factors, I think it's actually more helpful for you to build up your knowledge structure in understanding, how does one cultivar necessarily different from another? Like by changing one attribute and by having the other two attributes or the other, multiple attributes remain the same, what's the impact of the final product? I think that would really help consumer to understand, the contribution of tweaking certain attributes in a product.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And having that level of transparency, will allow people to develop a more complex set of preferences. So, speaking of high quality matcha, we put together a list of different attributes that we would consider are the status quo of high quality matcha. And, we don't want to be the armchair experts. So I would like to pose this as a starting place rather as the finish line of what, is the status quo of high quality matcha is. So it's the beginning of a list. And, we wanted to go through some of the factors that you could see on a label to help identify this. So after, doing tons of research and tasting lots of different matchas and speaking to matcha people and reading a lot online, our compilation of what is generally considered high quality attributes of a good matcha are umami taste. And, this one's also a little debatable depending what your preferences are. But certainly, if you're paying more for matcha, for quote unquote, objectively quote unquote, higher quality matcha, the more money you spend, the more umami the product's going to be. So it's also heavily correlated with price. So umami taste, number one. Two, radiant color, also really tends to matter. Delicate flavors, so the subtlety and nuance and complexity that you're getting, other than just like green, grassy umami, you can get a lot of other flavor expressions which people pay for. Reduced bitterness, so a lack of flaws is another way of putting it, and probably the biggest flaw is that it tastes bitter. And then last, and we kind of put an asterisk next to this one, is flavor profile consistency. So we think for the traditional companies, this is highly important for what would be considered a high quality product. But for the new single origin, single cultivar matcha companies that have ultra transparent labels, I would say flavor profile consistency doesn't matter at all because they're celebrating the inherent flavor differences that matcha or tencha can have because of it's an agricultural product and the weather's a little different every year. Farming practices might be a little different year to year, producer to producer. And that's something they want to shine a light towards. So, if we zoom into umami taste, Songjun, what are some of the attributes that can be done by a farmer to express umami taste, the nurture and nature components towards this expression?
Right. Well, first of all, the endless pursuit of umami taste is very Japanese. You can see that in all kinds of food and beverage products, not just in matcha, but also like dashi and the very, invention of MSG and, in all the ramens, in all the soup-based dishes in Japan, they're all into umami. And by having a higher umami notes in tea, you can do either hybridization, by crossbreeding certain cultivars to reach a higher umami notes. You can add a lot of fertilizers during the growing
Mm.
process, so to really enhance the nitrogen content in the soil, to boost up the amino acid content in the tea. And shading, that's to prevent sunlight from getting to the matcha bush, to convert all the excess amino acid into catechins, which are more astringent and bitter. And of course, doing the processing procedures, they use steaming to lock in the very green umami fresh notes in the tea leaf, from it to degrade or get oxidized by oxygen into other compounds that are not umami anymore. So these are usually the ways for tea growers or tea producers in Japan to really boost up the umami taste in their tea.
Yeah. And one thing to double click on here, and it's one of the reasons why good organic matcha is so rare, is particularly because of the fertilizer. The Japanese tea industry uses an insane amount of fertilizer, particularly because they like this umami taste. To get your levels of amino acids and L-theanine so high, you need very nitrogen-rich soil. The problem with very nitrogen-rich soil is that it attracts a lot of pests,
Bugs
and
like it.
therefore, you need pests. Bugs like it. Everything likes nitrogen-rich soil.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to have traditional organic farming practices, or even non-traditional farming practices that are organic, that end up producing a high-quality product, particularly because you just can't get as much nitrogen in the soil. Now, not all fertilizer is created equal. I've heard that there are some tea growers, I think the one I'm thinking of is an Uji, who will not fertilize his plants with anything that he wouldn't eat himself. And I think
Mm.
he imports, I think it's like mackerel or sardines, I don't know, some oily fish from Finland and mixes it with rice. And that is the fertilizer. Like, not all fertilizer is synthetic, probably very
Interesting.
expensive. And one reason to pay for higher prices from a farmer that's doing such practices.
Now I can see
I
why the
believe
bugs
it's
like it
Suji's.
so much. I like it too.
Yeah, probably those tea plants might eat better than a lot of people. But and then of course there's synthetic fertilizer, which honestly we don't have a huge problem with. Like, without synthetic fertilizer, right, the world couldn't supply enough food for everyone. Wonderful invention to take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into fertilizer. It saved a lot of people from starving. So that's not necessarily a problem inherently, but it is unfortunate that if you do it, you need to compensate usually by using a lot of pesticides. And there's just no way around it. So if you want a lot of umami taste, that's what you get, and that's what you see in the vast majority of the Japanese tea industry. So when you're looking on a label and it's being advertised as organic, it's less likely that you're going to get a very umami rich thing, which for some people might be a good thing. If you
Yeah.
don't love umami profiles, you can both reduce the amount of pesticides you're consuming and have less umami taste.
Woohoo! Like this is extremely of a Japanese preference. For a lot of consumer that I have talked to, the opinion about umami notes is very polarized. Like there are people outside of Japan really like this flavor, but there are also a lot of consumers out there would describe the taste being like seaweed soup, like seafood. It would not remind them, or they would not expect this flavor coming from tea necessarily, and that's kind of a put off.
No, for sure. And just reflecting a bit on, some of the things we were talking about earlier, the Japanese tea industry is very well regulated as an agricultural product. So even if it's non-organic, there's all sorts of rules about where you can spray, what you can spray, how long you can spray it for, what the time difference is between when you spray it and when the harvests are. And then a lot of matcha goes through lab testing. And when we start doing our own sourcing, we'll also go through lab testing to make sure that everything, is in spec and doesn't have tons of fertilizer on it, that it could pose any risk to human health. Agriculture in Japan is very modern, very complex, and compliance is very high compared to a lot of other countries for such agricultural commodity products and specialty products. Okay. Yeah, so another thing that is worth, I guess, two more things if you care about umami taste and high quality tea, and what to look for on the label. The number of days shaded definitely matters. So the more you shade, the less opportunity that plant gets to convert savory and umami amino acids and L-theanine into bitter and astringent catechins. So both the type of shading and the degree of how much light penetration gets to those bushes matters, and also how long it was shaded for. But even this, it's a little more complex because you're not in control of the weather, and you really don't want to pick tea on a rainy day. So, in some cases, you might need to shade it for fewer days because the weather's not cooperating with you, and it will result in a higher quality product than if you wait, I don't know, 45 days shaded, but the weather's going to be really bad. So, in as a general trend, the longer you shade, the more umami you'll make the tea. So, the difference between 35 days and 40 days, the 35-day one might be higher quality, just because of factors that are outside of the control of the farmer.
That's interesting. But Ryan, so when we are talking about shade growing tea, um, it will certainly increase the umami notes for the tea bushes in general. But to begin with, some of the cultivars are just inherently more umami than the others, right?
Yeah, that's a great comparison between nature and nurture, right? Fertilizer and shading are all nurture. They're all things that the farmer can do actively, some process-driven outcomes to create more umami taste. But there's also nature, genetics of these plants themselves, and different cultivars can be more or less umami than others. And you can get cultivars both by crossbreeding, but also by just selecting what they call a mother tree. So trees, especially when they go through something called zyri, it's seed propagation. So instead of grafting, which creates identical clones, there is some genetic drift when you graft. But the best way to create new flavor profiles in tea between different bushes is for seed propagation. So like pollination, and it's a form of sexual reproduction, and you end up getting different types of tea bushes, and you can kind of narrow them down. And there's a really cool story about the discovery of something called Nerino cultivar. So for anyone who's never had Nerino, it is the most intense umami cultivar, at least that I've ever had. It is kind of insane. The first time I had it, I almost didn't believe that it was matcha. Nerino contains twice the amount of L-theanine, the source of umami, compared to conventional varieties, and also inherently produces fewer catechins.
Whoa, that's very interesting, Ryan. So how did they discover that cultivar in the first place?
So I'm actually going to read it directly off of the website of the producers of this. Excuse my pronunciation, and actually, Zongjun, let me just send this to you.
It's Hori Shichimenyan.
It's like one too many syllables at the end of that word for me to confidently say. But they invented or discovered or I guess, cultivated the Narino and Ogunoyama cultivars. And it's apparently took over 20 years to do this. So this is straight from their website. For an individual, not laboratories or large scale tea plantations, selecting cultivars of the tea plants is a monumental task. The process started in 1981. Since then, Noble, a fifth generation owner, has carefully observed all the tea plants in the tea plantation every single year and has handwritten notes preserved over time, not only describing the taste and aroma, but the number of shoots, weight, and harvest yield in great detail. The initial 2,000 plants were gradually narrowed down to 58 cultivars, and then 24 varieties, and eventually 8 varieties. In 1994, two final candidate varieties were selected. These two varieties were cultivated on an experimental basis before they were finally registered in 2002, a good 20 years after starting to work on these cultivars. And one is Narino, and the other is Ogonoyama. And they make matcha out of both. So the original Ogonuyama tree, the mother tree, is 400 years old. I'm not sure if it says it about the Narino tree, but it's really cool the way that this is done here, where they're like literally identifying a single tree as a good set of characteristics, and then cultivating it probably through grafting.
Very interesting. Do they do any seed propagation crossbreeding with these trees?
That's a good question. No idea. Took 20 years to go this far, so maybe they are. It's just very much in process.
All right, I'll see them in next 20 years.
Do people do specific seed propagation where you can pollinate one bush with another? Actually, I don't know how that works, if that can be done purposefully.
Yeah, they do that all the time.
Okay,
And
okay,
at least they do that for Chinese tea too. Um, I'm not sure if that's the practice in Japanese tea.
okay. Interesting. As like one of the methods to create new cultivars.
Yeah, yeah.
But, anyway, this is a really great example of nature doing its thing, creating genetic diversity with plants that have different characteristics and produce different degrees of compounds. In this case, L-theanine, Narino producing double the amount that conventional cultivars create. Most likely they're alluding to Yabukita. It's the most conventional variety. So yeah, the cultivar can play a pretty big impact, has a pretty big impact on the degree of umami taste. So that was a lot to unpack just for umami and what you could see on a label. So just to summarize, you could select different cultivars that are naturally more umami than others. You can look at the degree of shade grown, where generally the longer the better, but with some exceptions. And whether or not it was organic has a pretty big impact on how nitrogen rich the soil could be, because it's much more difficult to manage fields with very nitrogenous soil without pesticides. So next, radiant color. Zongjun, do you want to deep dive into this one?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, color is one of the most important characteristic that people care about matcha when they discern the quality. So generally, the greener, the brighter, the more vibrant the color, the better the tea. There are a few ways to achieve that sort of color outcome. Hybridization and cross breeding different cultivars is certainly one of the method. There are more teas are just naturally brighter, has brighter color than other teas in general, without any other processing or different growing method. And shading can certainly play a huge role in the matcha's color development of the tea leaves. So usually, the more you shade, the more you prevent the tea leaf from receiving sunlight, the more chlorophyll it wanted to produce to utilize the very limited sunlight that it can get. So which means it will turn greener and brighter. And steaming, of course, can denature the oxidized that will break down chlorophyll. So that will help to preserve the greenness after the tea is being processed. And of course, you can also use blending to blend different color into the final can, and you can intentionally select colors with brighter and more vibrant color palette and blend it into other less colorful tea powders and make it overall more colorful. And of course, at the end, fresh milling is certainly the best way to present the freshest, most vibrant color matcha that you can get. Oxygen is definitely the largest enemy when it comes to tea powder, and oxidation can greatly reduce the vibrancy and also uh, the green color from the tea powder and turn it into a yellowish, duller, grayish color by the end of the day.
Yeah. I think one reason why color is such a focus for quality is it's one of the most obvious, not only is it the most obvious visual indicator that something's wrong, but also it really shows a matcha's age. As matcha ages, has oxidative stress, heat stress, just general aging, it will make it turn paler and paler as chlorophyll breaks down into its more oxidative products, which are naturally more yellow or gray. And by the way, also has a flavor change. So, at least in the States, you have a market that's flooded with matcha that you have no idea when it was milled, other than a Best By date, which, a lot of Best By dates, tea is a non perishable product. So, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 3 years, but really it's not going to go bad from a food safety perspective. But, the color is going to get really horrible.
Yeah.
Also, really low industrial quality ball milled versus a natural stone mill. Ball mills produce a lot of heat, it's usually used to create culinary grade product, which is another reason why culinary grade is usually a dollar more gray color, is because it's been heat damaged, which also damages those chlorophyll, makes it less green. So it can be a signal of quality when you really zoom out broad strokes between the really low end and the really high end. But as you said, Zongjun, different cultivars naturally express different like hues of color. Like Okumadori, for example, is super famous for being very green, and it's really commonly used in blends to create a much nicer color. But there's great cultivars that are naturally more dull on the high end. So I would say like the rule around radiant color is very true if you're distinguishing, between the lowest of lows and the highest of highs. But if you're just within specialty, color is a less reliable indicator for quality.
Yeah, but I guess for the status quo that we have right now, and especially for the non single origin matcha, this color gradient can actually be a pretty useful spectrum for you to tell the freshness of the matcha, basically.
Yeah, no, for sure. Even within a single can, even when you open a can, you start to see color changes happening.
Yeah, that's
Especially if you're
not going
buying
to
in
lie
larger
to you.
quantities. Yep, very good indicator. That's true. So even amongst the highest end, it does give you some sense of age. Which is one thing that we're really pushing for, is that more transparent mill dates. Even if it's a range, is even more helpful. To not, hide behind obscuring a mill date is super useful. So you know how fresh your product is. Because, there's so much surface area it's going to oxidize and, impact things like color.
Yeah,
Um,
but this rule doesn't necessarily apply when you go to like the super low end, or sometimes even just low to medium end products, because some of them might be color additives, which is actually a
mm,
thing that people should be careful of. Some gardenia extract can really increase the color vibrancy. Although they're like totally safe to consume, but it's not necessarily a good indicator anymore when it comes to that kind of products.
yeah. So like no additive is something really important to look for on a label, especially if you're working in the lowest end, even if you're like making a cookie, for example, if you want a pure product. So just to summarize, if if color is something that's very interesting and you're very important to you, definitely the number of days it was shaded, definitely the cultivar that it was from, and most importantly, probably how fresh that matcha is going to have a huge impact. So looking for things like mill dates, or having some sense of how long that tencha has been powdered into matcha, are all going to help indicate what that color is going to be. All right. Next is delicate flavors, which is probably one of the more interesting things to double click on. So, what are the things other than umami, taste, and the color that are present providing a sensory experience. Sungjun, want to walk us through what some of those are?
This one is exceptionally long. Why don't we dive into each point together? Well,
Okay.
the first one is definitely hybridization of different cultivars. Different cultivar, they naturally will have different flavor profile compared to each other. So it's just like, products like wine, like cider, like coffee. You have different grapes that taste different. You have different apple that tastes different. You have different coffee beans that taste different. So same theory applies to tea.
Yeah, absolutely. Where something like Yabukita is pretty balanced, a little bitter, like a little bit sweet, a little grassy. Something like Asahi is going to be more creamy and full and um, very nuanced and subtle. And I've heard that a lot of people describe Okumodori as being very vegetal and having a lot of vegetal undertones. So it really depends on what you're looking for. But any cultivar of matcha is going to come with a bunch of other flavors that you might like or you might dislike. So learning what those cultivars are and what those flavors are is really important on anyone's learning journey when you're searching for delicate flavors and complexity in matcha.
That's right. And the next one's Toa. Well, tea bushes grow on soil. So, it's naturally going to absorb a lot of the flavor coming from the environment surrounding it. So, anything related to altitude, related to soil condition, related to sunlight exposure, and also local flora and fauna, all of those could play a very important role in, the final expression of the tea flavor profile.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, different regions are always going to express different flavors. And it's one of the most interesting thing about specialty products is kind of learning the taste of the land, the taste of the soil and the air around and how that impacts it. Some common places might be like everyone talks about Uji and Kyoto Prefecture tea, or Yame in Fukuoka. You can go to Shizuoka, which is where a lot more mass-produced tea is, and there's many other regions. I heard there's some pretty interesting matcha coming out of Gifu Prefecture, as well as Kagoshima, as well, and as well as many others. So it's there's a lot to learn. And actually, we're still on our learning journey. Most of the matcha that we've had is available to us as consumers has been widely from Yame or from Uji,
Hmm.
at least on the higher ends.
Yeah. This is really, I guess, one of the starting point of consumers starting to fantasize about, the tea that they consume and have this romantic or romanticized feeling, of the place that the tea is coming from. It's not just tasting the tea, but tasting the environment, the culture, and the people that grows the tea, coming from a place that's so far away from you. But it's right now sitting in front of you and you can taste it and you can develop a preference towards it.
Yeah, it can just be transformed. When I was living in New York, I don't know, it was about 6 or 7 years ago, I went to there was tea dealers, 29B, if anyone knows that tea house in East Village or Alphabet City, hosted 3 or 4 national winners of tea competitions. I forget what their exact awards were, but there was a Yame tea tasting, and it was the first time I really had real Gokuro, which is a shade-grown loose leaf green tea, and they put on just the right amount of water so you would get 1 drop of tea, or maybe it was 2 drops. You get almost nothing, and it's very carefully weighed out. Uh, and I took a sip of it, and my mind was blown. I've never had anything, any liquid that's ever tasted that way. So pure and clean and umami and intensely umami and sweet. It was crazy. It was a really cool experience and a very formative sensory experience for me and connecting with the people who had made it. And it got me really interested in Yame tea. So, I agree. The romanticization of place and terroir cannot be overlooked. And, it'd be really nice to have more storytellers to start telling the story of other places,
Yeah.
outside of Uji and Yame, um, to open this up a little bit. I know
Mhm.
Kettle is doing a lot of work and Oika is doing a lot of work in that as well, but I can't wait till we start to see even more vendors start doing more storytelling and discovery for these regions,
There
other
are so
regions.
many other places that grows tea too, and also even within Uji and Yame, you have all these sub terroir. that could be very interesting. Like these places are large.
Yeah.
The environment and the weather right there cannot be similar to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Even down the road, yeah, exactly, you have different things. Make very cool vertical tastings.
Hmm.
That'd be cool. If anyone listening has a cafe, and if we're deep into sourcing, we'd love to do a couple pop-ups of doing some vertical tastings one day of like these micro terroirs. That'd be cool.
That would be wonderful.
Please reach out.
Right. The next one is harvest method. So this one is also very interesting because like machine types of machine harvest and versus hand picking really can have a large difference in the final flavor profile because the leaf composition will be drastically changed by how you harvest them.
Yeah. No, drastically changed. And the way to think about this is like precision picking. Basically the machine picked is a glorified lawnmower with a big kind of chute on the back to catch everything, and you're not precision picking anything. You could argue it's slightly less important in matcha because when tencha, unground matcha, gets refined, it's destemmed. So like a lot of the thick stems that's associated with that are getting separated out. But still, you're not getting the exact picks that you want, which is where Tizumi or hand-picked tea is so important. Um, that said, hand-picked tea is getting more and more rare, especially in Japan, and demands insane prices because of
Yeah,
all the labor that's associated. And there's a
no
real
one wants
lack
to
of
pick
skilled
tea.
labor.
No
Yeah,
one
no
wants
one
to
wants to
pick
pick
tea.
tea.
It's really really a pain. It's not just in Japan. You're seeing tea growing regions in China and Korea suffering, and Taiwan suffering the same thing. Um, like no one wants to do this because it's so laborious and tedious during tea harvest season. And for the very few that are willing to do it, in China, you will see them these group of elder or older female tea pickers. We call them the tea ayi. They will travel from places to places, all the way from Wuyi to Chaozhou and all the way into Yunnan to follow the harvest season in different region. And they are the only one would do it. And all of these local regions, they don't want to pick tea. All of the young people, they don't even want to grow tea. So that's a very, very painful phenomenon that we collectively have to face. Not just in Japan but also in other regions too.
Yeah, everywhere. My girlfriend's uncle owns a winery in France, and he was complaining that no one wants to work anymore during the harvest season. Like most of French wine is picked by Romanian or Bulgarian people who come in and work for the season and then leave. In the States too, it's a big problem. No one wants to do this agricultural work, and we've both picked tea. Sam, you've picked more tea than I have, but it's not a glamorous job. There's a lot of
No, it's
bugs.
not.
It's hot. It's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, the sunlight, the rain, the freezing coldness up in the mountain, or the burning hotness down in the valley, and occasionally tarantula will say hi to you, jumping from bushes to bushes. It's pretty horrifying.
Especially on your special hand-picked organic tea farm. You want to see bugs. Anyway, it just goes to say if you on a tea label, if it says it's hand-picked or Tizumi, just the word for it on a matcha label, you should take extra special care to appreciate the moment and
Yeah,
all of the hands and labor and skill that went into making that.
definitely deserves a higher price compared to some of the other attributes.
Actually, what I was just about to say. If you're not paying upwards of $30 a jar for that, you should question whether or not it was actually handpicked. It's one thing that really deserves a higher price based on the labor associated with it. Like, just imagine, like, as a parallel, you could buy lobster at a store and it was 100% taken off the shell and it was $5, right? You'd be a little skeptical on what it is that you're buying and whether or not, what's inside. Similar thing, it's you shouldn't want to find a lot of value in a hand-picked tea, or value as in like cheap budget value tea. If that should be an alarm bell on a label. Anyway,
Next one is processing. So this one definitely, plays a pretty large impact in the final flavor profile outcome. Things is like duration of steaming, and how to tweak the temperature and time. All of that will have a great impact on the flavors.
yeah. And this is one area where you typically won't see it on a label. So apparently the art of steaming is very difficult to get right. And it's producer to producer. And if you think about it, I think Zach from Kettle was the one who made this point, was that most tea producers get 50 harvest seasons in their entire life to optimize. 50 shots. That's what they have. And their ability to tweak parameters and to, they don't have endless iterations. And apparently one of the things that's really hard to get to nail is exactly how long it needs to be steamed. The more you steam, the deeper the color it gets, but you also lose a lot of nuance. So something steamed very quickly is kind of like poaching something very quickly. You preserve a lot of what's in that thing and a lot of the flavors. Or if you really steam it, it starts breaking down the cellulose, it gets a little more cloudy, and produces a very different product. And usually it's on the lower end, not exclusively. But even within that range, it's an art to get that right. And that you would not expect to see on the label, but it would be associated with the skill of the producer. Just like how some
Right.
producers in wine are naturally going to demand higher prices because they're just so good at their craft. Similar thing here, where a lot of these processing decisions can't really make it on the label. It'd be really weird if someone put steaming time, right? Maybe that's also kind of considered part of their IP.
I spent 50 years to this point, and I'm just going to tell you.
Well, it probably depends too on like other factors, like if it was raining that day, how many days you had to shade it for, right? The predictive model is probably multivariate, where you need to change the amount of steam time. I mean, it's kind of like noodles. Like, with like when you go into an Ichiran noodle joint, they change the noodle recipe every day based on the humidity because
Yeah,
I guess
yeah,
the
yeah.
gluten
Or like
forms a little different.
espresso machines.
Yeah, exactly. You have to dial them in every time, every day, based on ambient conditions. Yeah.
Hmm.
Another big one that relates to labeling with regard to delicate flavors that is very important to everyone listening is harvest season. So you talk about, you always hear first harvest is best, and that is generally true. Second harvest or third harvest going into the summer or autumn is almost always worse. It's too hot, and the best tea plants are not harvested that many times. You'll exhaust a plant like that if it can be harvested. The best tea plants are usually harvested once a year, and sometimes twice a year. All right, and last on this for delicate flavors is fresh milling. Want to tackle that one, Sam? And how mill dates are so important for preserving delicate flavors?
All right, fresh milling. This one's hard. For most of the commercially available matcha that you can find out in the world, they're centrally milled in Japan, and the tea that you end up getting versus when they are freshly milled in Japan, the time between them can be weeks to even months. The flavor profile can be very different because due to all the oxidation that happens along the way. And nowadays, you are seeing brands like Johnny Matcha and Oika doing really fresh mill that ranging anywhere from a couple weeks to 24 hours. And we can see how the outcome really changed. The sheer freshness, the sheer abundance and intensity of the flavor profile can be very different from a matcha that comes from the same cultivar or even the same garden, but was milled a couple months or a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, it's really important if you care about like nuance and like the definition of the flavor before oxygen has had the chance to start changing those flavors.
Yeah, I mean, back in the days, there's really a severe lack of infrastructure to create ultra fresh milled matcha. The mills are just so hard to be procured and transport, to places outside of Japan. And it's very very great that someone has figured this out and end up doing it, be able to do it outside of Japan. But still, it's very difficult to make it more ubiquitous.
Yeah. We've basically seen two solutions to this problem. Is one is by compressing the supply chain. So sourcing direct from farmers or near directly from farmers, like you see companies like Kettle or like Johnny Matcha doing, and really shortening the supply chains and having more freshness guarantees. Or you have people like Mark, like Rivers, I think River and Stone Tea. Apologize, forget their name, and Jaga Silk in British Columbia, who are milling matcha fresh on their own equipment and taking that on. But it's one of the areas that we're very interested in and have identified is this lack of infrastructure so that people can mill it fresh, even at the point of consumption. And how do we take new technology, new materials, and functional design, and kind of shrink what's going on in an Ishiyusu as best we can into a countertop device to deliver a radically better experience with matcha preserving its fresh characteristics and in particular its flavor and nutrition. Our dream would be to have every matcha can to have a mill date on it, and we want to have the infrastructure to make that world possible, so that can be included on every label. Just to summarize, for delicate flavors and nuanced and how that can appear on a label, definitely terroir matters and understanding kind of the taste of the place. Cultivar, definitely going to matter, which is why like single origin, single cultivar, that have blends that have components, so you know what percentage is what in a blend. Harvest season also definitely going to matter. You want first harvest or spring harvest is always the highest quality. And then around mill date. So picking vendors that have either mill date guarantees or have transparent mill dates written on the label. All will definitely matter. All right, and last main section, reducing bitterness, lack of flaws. So, Zongjun, want to give a high level overview of that one and how it can appear on a label?
Yeah, reduced bitterness is definitely a general preference among consumers nowadays. First of all, hybridization and cultivation selection. Some of the cultivars are just naturally less bitter than others. By intentionally selecting and breeding those cultivars together, you can end up having matcha that's just generally less bitter, that have more sweet and more creamy notes in general. Shading can also have play a very large role. By covering the tea from sunlight, you are essentially blocking the conversion of amino acid into catechins, which is more bitter and more astringent. And harvest method can definitely play a very large role. Whether or not the tea is handpicked, or if it's machine harvest, by having more stemmy substance introduced into the final product can really increase the bitterness.
Yeah, or
And
older leaves.
or older leaves, that's right. And the very last one is also fresh milling. Old and stale matcha can definitely be more bitter and less visually appealing than fresh milled, green and vibrant matcha.
Yeah. And actually, we have series coming out on our Instagram. So if you don't follow us there, it's called the Why My Matcha is Bitter series, where we break this down into even greater detail. But a lot of the same things matter, where you're looking for shade duration, harvest method, uh, whether or not it was how fresh it is, and then again knowing your cultivars. And I think sort of knowing your cultivars is one of the most important things to the specialty market, because it can really navigate you to what it is that you want and you're looking for, depending on what's important to you. Like, is umami taste the most important thing? Know your cultivars. If color is the most important thing, know your cultivars. If bitterness and avoiding it, or maybe you like it, is very important to you, definitely know your cultivars. It's one of the easier ones to do with the existing degree of transparency we see on labels. And then, of course, just other factors certainly matter around terroir, around fresh milling, around harvest method, shading, and all of the other things that we've mentioned that can appear on a matcha label.
Yeah, I mean, reduced bitterness is really a general preference at the current stage. Some can argue that a certain level of bitterness is very important, and some might actually like the bitterness in the tea. So I think that this will be a very interesting attribute to add on the label, not necessarily the bitterness level, because like the human perception of bitterness really varies by a lot. It's arguably not a good metric to have. So I guess by assessing the bitterness from what kind of cultivar that went into this tea, how many days it has been shaded, or the harvest method, or how long has this tea being milled, would be good attributes that help you to calculate how bitter this tea will be, and if that will fit your preference.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of these things are all around finding and discovering your own preferences and being able to look at all of the information that's on a label to find the best thing. And I think as an industry, whether or not you're a matcha brand or a cafe, bringing this information to the forefront is going to help people find things that they like. And then, any consumers listening, learning through and getting all of these different reference samples and tasting so you can build your own predictive model of what you like, just like in any other product. It's just, that's the fun. That's the fun of tea in general, is discovering your own preferences and how different processes or nature and nurture components result in very different experiences that we can all experience by this one leaf. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. I guess that's really the future of labeling, right? Like to offer as much information as possible, with no subjectivity, to let consumer decide which consumer path they want to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even a mix of subjective and objective, like even broad category, like this is approximately how we would suggest to be used, or these are the way these notes typically get expressed, right? Some people really like chocolatey profiles or umami profiles or refreshing profiles. I think like those type of buckets could be very interesting for people, but not necessarily product specific, but like, label specific. Like, these groups of cultivars generally taste this way, kind of like what we see with wine education. Like if you
Hmm.
go to winefolly.com, they have great resources, both going over place and grape type. Like if you're interested in this, then you could eat it with this. It's usually expressed as these cultivars. If you have a Pinot Noir in California versus France, these are the general differences in flavor expression, and here's why they taste different. Like it's I think realizations can still be made, but maybe not by the person selling it, at least in a way that's saying, this is better than this, where it's a lot of top down imposition.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
or
I
if they
mean,
do say this is better than this, right, they're really explaining why. I guess it's the problem is that not enough people explain why. They just say
yeah.
this is rare, this is authentic.
Or you can just simply reflect it by, selling it more expensive. People will naturally agree with you or not.
True. Quick way to lose that reputation, though.
Or, like, someone or some group of people might just end up discovering that umami is really not their thing. And, by using less pesticide or fertilizer, by giving the tea bush, less shade grown period, it naturally will reduce the cost of making those tea, which the tea might be, more friendly to your wallet, compared to the more umami matcha.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, ultimately, it's all going to come down to the decisions of the vendors and the consumers, and who has the power to put pressure on whom, and we're just passengers on this, and hopefully we can make some impact by swaying some people's opinions. But it's going to be interesting to see how this shapes out, compared to other specialty industries like coffee or beer or chocolate. So I'm excited for the future of matcha labeling.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah. And you and I are about to go to Japan for about a month to do some sourcing. So we're going to have a lot of firsthand experience at like what is it like to source these teas, talk to these farmers, and understand even more the complexities of why maybe
Mhm.
certain things aren't put on the label that we're not even aware of yet. So we want to share that journey along the way as we go, and kind of share our discoveries as we do the hard work. It's really hard to actually create something. It's very easy to comment on someone's matcha if it's good or bad, or critique it because this isn't on the label or that's not on the label. but actually bringing products to market, as we are learning, is
Uh,
so incredibly difficult.
it's
I'm
so easy to criticize, but it's always a difficult task to accomplish when you're sitting on the other side of the table.
we're going to be transparent. If we got something wrong in this, we're going to talk about it later for sure on the podcast. And we're very much open to our both being proven wrong and changing our opinions on these topics as we go from more observers to doers in bringing matcha products to market. But we'll document that journey, and ultimately we want the specialty market to grow and flourish, and that's what we're in service of, is really raising the quality ceiling and support the specialty principles that can make this industry incredibly interesting.
The future is vibrant and green.
And it's going to taste great. All right. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on, as well as sharing this podcast with a friend. And please be on the lookout for new content. Thanks.
All right. See you in the next episode.
Take care.